On our trip round Scotland's North Coast 500, we drove the route, marked here in red, anti-clockwise. The yellow stars show the start and end of each leg. We started in Inverness, where we had spent the night at the Lycia Rooms Plus. The following morning, after a good breakfast, we crossed the Keswick Bridge over the Bewley Firth on the A9, and then onto the A832 on the Black Isle. We then drove along the edge of Munlochy Bay. We parked near the golf course in Fortrose Bay and walked along the footpath between the course and the sea. When we reached Chanonry Lighthouse, we went down onto the shingle and round the tip of the point. This is supposed to be a good spot to view dolphins, but all we saw was the seal you can just make out in the top left of the picture. We continued to the ridge above Cromarty Firth, where we could see the yards where oil platforms are built and maintained. After driving through the pretty little village of Cromarty, we took a narrow, unpaved road to the South Souter viewpoint, with superb panoramas over the hills and sea, including the caves at Nick Point. We then went back through the village and took the B9163 along the edge of the Firth to rejoin the A9 and cross the Cromarty Bridge. We continued to Invergordon, from where we looked back to the Black Isle and its oil rigs. Next stop was the beach at Shandwick Bay, which is popular for paddleboarding. It was a little bit tricky walking across the pebbles to get back to the road. A little further on is Ballintor Harbour. Very close to here is the Mermaid of the North, a bronze statue made in 2014, part of a sculpture trail that includes 3 giant salmon. We continued to Port Mahomack, a small fishing village. 3 miles from Port Mahomack is Tarbert Ness Lighthouse, which was designed by Robert Stevenson in 1830. We stopped for a short time in Tain, the oldest borough in Scotland, which has lots of flowers. The Rose Garden, which was opened by Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother in 1966 to celebrate the 900th year of the borough, is next to the Murray Monument. Driving across the Dornoch Firth Bridge, we soon came to Dornoch, where we spent the next 2 nights at the Amalfi B&B, just a short walk from the centre. The next day, after breakfast, we went to find out more about the Dornoch area and started by exploring the lovely little town, whose old castle is now an hotel. On the main street is the cathedral with a cockerel and a crow on top of the weather vane. The original cathedral was built in 1224 and was burned down in 1570. It was not rebuilt fully until 1837. Outside in the cathedral garden is the Anderson Memorial Drinking Fountain, erected in 1892. On a hill at the back of Dornoch is a viewpoint over the whole town and out over the Firth. Back in town, a small stream runs through channels and tunnels. We then took the road to Embo, where a narrow path leads to a rocky beach. The road was very narrow, and even the car panicked when this came past. Loch Fleet is a sea loch and national nature reserve, surrounded by sand dunes and mudflats. It's a good place for watching seals. We continued along Loch Fleet to go on the Lairg Loop. Here we had to give way to the Partridge family. We continued along the road until we came to the southern end of Loch Shin, where there's a hydroelectric power station. Here is the Church Hill Woodland Trail. On the trail are carved benches and animals, which we passed on our stroll up to the War Memorial and viewpoint. Turning south, we continue to the Falls of Shin, where the River Shin cascades over rocks, and salmon can sometimes be seen leaping. We made a detour of about 10 miles to visit Coit Church, a Church of Scotland parish church designed by Thomas Telford in the 19th century. The people of Coit were subsistence tenant farmers, but as the landowner introduced commercial sheep farming in 1845, the 18 tenant families, some 90 people, were evicted from their homes in what came to be known as the clearances. We returned to the main road and back to Dornoch, where we found there was to be a pipe band performance in the main square. The following day found us back on the main route, headed towards Wick. After driving through Golspie, we came to Dunrobin Castle, historic home of the Earls and Dukes of Sutherland. We walked from the car park through the woods to the house, which dates from 1275 and stands on the edge of a cliff overlooking the North Sea. Entering the house, we went through the hallway to the breakfast room. Next came the dining room, where some of the family silver is on display. Beyond this is the drawing room, with an interesting tapestry. Next came the library, with a lion skin rug. The bathroom seemed full of chamber pots. We saw the children's playroom and bedroom. Adjoining them was the nanny's bedroom. Further along the corridor were the robing and uniform rooms. In total, there are 189 rooms in the castle. Don't quite know what this was doing on the landing. Back down the formal staircase, we went through the Duke's study and out onto the terrace overlooking the gardens. It's quite a steep flight of stairs down to the gardens, which are filled with all kinds of flowers and shrubs. Just after 11 o'clock, people began to gather on the lawn for the falconry display.
That all stopped, and he had to look after the birds but couldn't get out to do.
The first bird on show was a hawk.
Hawks tend to have a very broad wing, quite wide from the front edge to the back edge.
Next came a gyrfalcon, the largest falcon in the world and a fierce predator in the high Arctic, where it chases down birds in flight or knocks them out of the sky. Eventually he allowed the falcon to have the lure, a chick. After spending some more time in the gardens, we drove up to Brora Beach, a wild, unspoiled beach alongside the local golf course. Here the North Sea can be pretty rough, and this boat was making a dash for the harbour. A little further north is Helmsdale, once home to the largest herring fishing fleet in Europe. About 5 miles further north is Badby Historic Clearance Village. It isn't a factory outlet, but one of the villages in the area where evicted tenants settled during the Highland clearances. It's reached via a rough footpath from the small car park. Very little is left except a few ruined stone walls, a stone monument, and a board showing what the village would have looked like. At Latheron Wheel there's a small harbour surrounded by rocks and cliffs, both on land and in the sea. The old bridge dates from 1726. Next came Libster. The harbour here is very elaborate and must provide good shelter. There's still lobster fishing carried out here. On the moors above Libster is the Hill of Many Stains, or stones. About 200 thin stones were laid out in 22 rows running north to south, about 4,000 years ago. No one knows who erected them or why, but it's clear they were carefully planned. A bit further along are the Walligo Steps, a man-made stairway of 330 steps, which were hand-cut. They lead down to a natural harbour, which was once a landing place for herring, salmon, whitefish and shellfish. Nearby and just inland is the Loch of Yarrows in an area rich in archaeological remains. From here it was just a short drive to Wick, where we stayed 2 nights at the Bank Guest House on the main street. After a good breakfast we set off to go around the top right corner of the country. Our first stop was at Staxigo Harbour. This former fishing village takes its name from the Norse inlet of the Stack. Just above is Noss Head Lighthouse. A single-track road from the A99 leads to the tiny village of Skersa. Cattle graze just over the fence from the harbour, and the John O'Groats Trail walking route runs on from the end of the road. Skersa Head itself is an interesting shape. We had to return by the same road and then headed to John O'Groats. Although famously the most northerly point in mainland Britain, it isn't in fact, and is a bit of a tourist trap, with just some fancy coloured houses and the famous signpost. Another side road leads to Duncansby Head Lighthouse. Turning west on the A836 we came to Gills Bay and were just in time to see the ferry arriving from Orkney. From here we went to Dunnet Head, the true most northerly point. Mary Ann's Cottage is a traditional Caithness cottage built in 1850, where Mary Ann Calder lived for 93 years. It's now a museum where visitors can see what crofting life was like in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The weather broke, so we returned to Wick via the B876. Next morning we set off on the A882 heading for Armadale, but at Loch Watton we took a detour on the B870 just to get more practice on narrow roads. In Thurso we went to see the ruins of St Peter's Kirk. It dates to at least 1125 and at one time was the principal church for the county. The kirk has been disused since 1832 when a replacement was built. It's a cruciform design and at one time part of it was used as a courthouse and prison. It's on the left bank of the River Thurso and opposite is Thurso Castle. The toilets are marked in Caithness speak for humans who prefer toilets with stalls and urinals or those with just stalls. Continuing along the north coast, driving between the sea and farmland, we came to Ray Bay with its sandy beaches and harbour. You can just catch a glimpse of Dounreay nuclear power station. The harbour was built in 1835 for about £3,000, was on sale in 2024 for £3.2 million. In Sandside Bay is an information board covering local history from the Vikings to nuclear power. The power station was shut down in 1994. The bay has a large sandy beach. There's a large car park at the viewpoint at Melvick Bay, a popular site for birdwatching. Nearby at Port Skerra, a plaque commemorates those lost in a shipwreck in 1842. The sky was still heavy after the previous day's rain. We took another side road where we had to give way to Highland cattle. We were going to see the former Strathy Point Lighthouse. We then returned to the main road to continue to Armadale, where we spent 2 nights at Armadale House, a Victorian mansion built in 1854 and a very comfortable and welcoming B&B. The following morning the cattle had moved on to the main road. From here we drove south on the A897 alongside the River Hallidale to Forcinard. The railway station is the RSPB visitor centre for the Forcinard Flows, part of the Flow Country, the largest blanket bog in Europe. This 4,000 square kilometre area of deep peat dotted with bog pools, is an important habitat for wildlife and became a World Heritage Site in July 2024. The boardwalk keeps visitors' feet dry as it crosses the bog, with information boards along the way. The boardwalk leads to the lookout tower, from where you can enjoy views over the flows. There's an alternative route back across paving stones, but the boardwalk is easier. The road here is very narrow, and it's essential to use passing places to allow traffic to go through in the opposite direction, especially when the traffic is like this. Next we turned onto the B871 and drove past Loch Baddenloch. At Sire we took the B873 along Loch Narva. We then turned north on the A836, passing Loch Loyal on the way back to the north coast and our B&B. The next morning we continued on the main route, following the A838 westwards. We crossed the Kyle of Tong and stopped at the water's edge to look across the Kyle. Continuing along the A838 we came to Loch Erriboll, where the road follows the edge of the loch. In the 19th century, lime was quarried from an island known as Horse Island. It was treated on the peninsula of Ardniki, where the remains of the kilns can still be seen. The narrow winding road continues round the loch, passing open moorland and stretches of forest. After Loch Erriboll is a small parking area where the Golden Eagle zip wire is based. This, the most northerly zipline in the UK, offers flights of 45 miles per hour, 100 feet above one of the most beautiful beaches in Scotland. Next came Inverness, where we could have visited Smoo Cave, if we'd had time. The A838 then turns inland, and we took a short detour along Loch Inchard to Kinloch Burvey. Back on the main road, we next came to Laxford Bridge, which was built in 1834. A crash on the bridge in 2009 meant that it had to be closed, meaning a detour of 100 miles. Wow. Here the route takes the A894, and shortly after we made another detour to Tarbert, where there's a passenger ferry to Hander Island, and a seafood restaurant. Back on the A894 we next came to Scarry Beach, where the almost white sand is divided by rocky inlets. After a short stop at the Assynt viewpoint, we drove onto the Carliskew Bridge car park. The curved concrete bridge crosses the loch and is a Category A listed structure. Shortly after the bridge, the route turns onto the B869. This steep, narrow, winding, single-track road has lots of beautiful scenery, but must be driven slowly and with great care. We arrived at the lovely Tor Druin B&B in Drumbeg, and this was the view from our bedroom. After watching a glorious sunrise, we set off to explore the area around Drumbeg. We started by driving west on the B869 coast road towards Loch Inver. First we came to the golden sands of Clashnessie Bay, before turning off on a twisty, windy side road to Store Point Lighthouse. Back on the B869 we passed little lochs and got our first view of Stack Polly, a mountain we'll see more closely later. Entering Loch Inver, we went to the famous pie shop, as our host had promised to warm them up for our evening meal. There's a lovely, busy harbour in Loch Inver, so we spent a bit of time just looking at the boats. We left Loch Inver on a by-road which followed the River Kirkaig, where we saw the world's biggest mushroom. Unless you know better. A muddy footpath leads to the Falls of Kirkaig. The road crossed the river and went over the hill to Loch Lurgane, and then ran alongside it with views of Stack Polly, Culmore and Culbeeg. Although the smallest of the three at 612 metres, Stack Polly is the most distinctive because of its rocky crest. Tiny streams from the mountain feed into the loch. Eventually the byway joined the A835, where we turned north to Knockan Crag. It's highly unusual in that layers of old rock lie on top of much younger rock, as opposed to the norm where young rock forms on top of old. In 1882, two geologists discovered that the Earth's forces can push older rocks up and over younger ones in a process called thrust. This rock reminded us of a face, eyes, nose, mouth. We continued to the A837 and drove along Loch Assynt, coming first to the remains of Calder House, once one of the grandest houses in Scotland. It was built in 1726 by the Clan Mackenzie to replace Ardvreck Castle, which we can see just up the road. The castle was built by the Clan MacLeod in 1490 and captured by Clan Mackenzie in 1672. It was destroyed by fire in 1737. From here we returned to Tor Druin to enjoy our pies. When we left Drumbeg on our last day, we met up with the annual Loch Inver tractor run. We were so fascinated with all the tractors that it was some time before we realised that we'd turned the wrong way at the end of the Drumbeg Road and should have been following the tractors, not filming them from in front. Turning round, we followed the slow procession for several miles until we turned off onto the A835, the road to Ullapool. With 15,000 inhabitants, Ullapool is the largest village we'd seen for several days. It has a large bustling harbour and is the ferry port for Stornoway on the Hebrides. A short distance from Ullapool is Leckmelm Arboretum. Planted in 1870, the Arboretum was restored in 1984. The surprisingly mild climate and high rainfall mean that a number of exotic plants thrive here. A network of paths lets you follow several small circuits within the garden. We caught glimpses of Loch Broom through the trees. We continued along Loch Broom until we came to our last stop, the Corrie Shallot Gorge National Nature Reserve. It's maintained by the National Trust for Scotland, and a new visitor centre was opened in 2023. A well-maintained path leads through the woods past a series of waterfalls. You can cross the deepest part of the gorge on the pedestrian footbridge, though this is not for the faint-hearted. From here it was a fast drive past Loch Garve and onto the Nethybridge Hotel for our last night at the end of this, the most beautiful road in Britain.